I'm so excited to welcome you all here to have a conversation with Alexander Chee. I'm Leah, the editor of Liminal magazine, and I'd just like to start tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In 2019, the legacy of white supremacy permeates our lives. It defines our past, terrorizes our present, and projects a horrific future. At a time when far-right extremism, white supremacy, and race politics are on the rise, we must renew our commitment to active anti-racism and equality. As part of this, I think, as a writer of colour, I'm constantly considering how best to move forward in this world. Alexander Chee is a writer who has created and generously shared his own kind of roadmap. In his debut novel, Edinburgh, his historical fiction, The Queen of the Night, and in this very good, amusingly titled book of essays, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, Alex proposes a model for bravery, for writing the self in uncertain times, for celebration and interrogation of his intersecting identities, and much more. Please welcome Alexander Chee. We're so lucky to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
How are you finding Melbourne?
Delicious. We've eaten very well since we've arrived, and all of my plans are for when I return to eat at other places so far. Today I decided that it was a kind of sightseeing to be eating well in Melbourne.
It's the only kind of sightseeing in Melbourne.
Yeah.
We thought we would start off with a little treat for you guys and have a short reading from something in the book.
I often don't know what I'm going to read before I read things, and I recently met someone else, the writer Jim Shepard, who also has this problem, so I feel less bizarre. But I thought I would read, Lee and I were talking earlier about what to read from, and I thought maybe I would just read from the title essay, which I don't often do, so here we go. It's not a how-to book, by the way, just in case anyone was not clear. I will only tell the truth, you decide. It's right there, after all. Like you could hold it, perfect, in one try. This vision of the novel you are sure you can write sits in your life like a gift from any god you might be willing to believe in, as suddenly real as any unexpected visitor. You must write it, you decide. It would be so easy. You watch each other carefully for years. When you begin, you are like someone left in the woods with an axe and a clear memory of houses, deciding to build a house. You decide you will teach yourself to furnish everything with that axe. You are the axe. The woods is your life. And yet when you sit down to try, the perfection is gone. The beautiful symmetry, the easy way of it, all of it is replaced by awkwardness, something worse than if your mind made only noise. When you stop, dejected, you see it again, perfect again, as if it is mocking you. Soon you learn that you see it only when you do not try. Thinking this may be its way of stopping you, but either way, you stop trying, and then start, and then stop. Perhaps you are unfamiliar with why you would try to undo yourself, why you would be your own worst enemy, or best friend, or that person who is sometimes both. Now you try to live with what you know. You still see it, even if it eludes you when you reach for it. What is the way into the place where it is? You wonder. Perhaps it is like the Venetian towns built to confuse pirates. You think you are headed toward the square with a fountain, and instead find yourself in an alley, out along the cliff wall, another life. There is that noise still in the mind, drawn over the surface of the entrance like camouflage. You find this only when you decide you must try again. You don't know this yet, but gods, even when you don't believe in them, do not give something easily, not even when the God is you. You didn't make this up, people say to you when you finally write it and give it to them to read. I did, you say, but then you feel as if you have dropped your disguise. Is this me? They ask, coldly. Their disguise, also dropped. You had hoped they would also see how perfect it was. You wonder if it is them, and you forgot somehow, if you are stupid in some way you didn't anticipate. The living reside uncomfortably in prose. This includes you. You, like the child who believes they are invisible because they stood in a shadow. This person, your reader, now says, there's no plot. You see this also. The novel revealed now is a string of anecdotes, and you cannot see what comes before or after. The events of your life like an empty field, and you there, shouting, novel. The writer who cried novel. Yes, yes, that was you. Invent something that fits the shape of what you know. To do this, use the situations but not the events of your life. Invent a character like you, but not you. You in the forest of yourself with the axe, building the house, sealing yourself within its walls. You are the ghost of the house you build and never live in, this house you make of your life. The space you occupy, more like the space between the wall and the paint. This is also the difference between you and the one you have invented to be you. This golem of the self, this house, now something anyone could visit and understand, unlike you. That is what you hope for now. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
It's protection from stage lights.
It's also very pretty.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is one of my favorite essays in the collection. And if you haven't read it yet, it's all kind of in epigrams or aphorisms, I guess. It's very slender, like a skeleton, I guess.
You could tweet it
In
a series.
I was wondering this. How did you come to the form of this particular essay?
I think the writer Anne Carson introduced me to the idea that an essay could be more like a poem, and that a poem could even be like an essay, that there could be something in between. And at least one of those lines in there is something that I have said to my students for a very long time, such that when, I had the good fortune to receive a prize from One Story Magazine as their Mentor of the Year last year, and they do this beautiful thing for the prize where they reach out to your former students and they invite them to submit recollections of you. And what was hilarious to me was some of the consistency of the advice over the years. And that line about the axe and the clear memory of houses was something that I said many times. So it was funny to find it again there. But I think sometimes when you teach a lot, you are always drawing from a kind of reservoir of knowledge that expands and remixes itself as you are talking to students, and some of those things that you say, become like those lines that you get into your head when you're about to start a poem, or at least that I do. Maybe not everyone starts a poem like that, but I do. But in this case, it was an essay, so it's a little bit less like writing an essay, a little bit more like writing a poem or a song or something.
Finding that space between a poem and an essay, kind of.
It was originally numbered as a kind of a list, and then we took the numbers out. I think the list poem is a wonderful structure because the list asserts a relationship between the things on the list, and so the reader is thrust into making the connections themselves, and so they can experience the list very differently, each of them, according to what their associations are.
Kind of like the other one, 100 Things About Writing a Novel?
Yes, that's right. Those are the 2 lyric essays in the collection.
So I'm very interested in how the collection kind of came together. Can you speak? How did you decide to pull it all into one book?
Well, I was invited to speak at the Columbia University nonfiction program's reading series by a wonderful writer by the name of Liz Harris. And I immediately realized that I did not have a book of essays or no nonfiction book. And I felt sort of naked. I knew there was no way to get a book out in time for the reading, but but in any case, I think I even sent an email to Liz essentially saying, I'm so sorry, I don't have a book, just in case you didn't notice. And she said, just send me a list of your favorites. So that was kind of how it began. I was making this list of favorite essays for her to share with her students. And as I did, I thought, oh, this looks like a table of contents to a book that I probably should have already published. So the essays were drawn from about the last 25 years. When I sat down to put the collection together, I realized that I had about 65 to 70 essays to choose from. I could have a collection out next year if I wanted.
Please.
But my husband was saying that I probably shouldn't flood the market with essays. So
I don't think the market would mind.
Thank you. I did know pretty quickly that I wanted the title essay that I just read from to be the title essay, and that kind of helped shape the book in its way. It had a tone and a thematic suggestion as well. So we started choosing things that were about how I came to writing, how I came to write my first novel, and the eventual structure of it. The essays begin with me as a reader who is learning to write things for his own pleasure as a young boy on an exchange program in Mexico. I had run out of things to read, and I started writing X-Men fan fiction before I knew what that was.
Does it still exist?
It may be in a notebook somewhere in my mother's house, actually I took a lot of those things away, and they're now in a basement in the Catskills. The last essay is me as a teacher of writing on the day after Trump's election of the United States, and at the school where I taught, it was like a terrorist attack had happened, and people were. Campus was empty. The town was empty. It's the only day I've never had any trouble parking on campus. People were walking across the campus weeping. People were weeping in offices. Students were weeping. It was pretty catastrophic. And then the next thing I had to do was to go teach a class. So,
I think you compare it to 9/11 in that kind of aftermath, that deep psychic depression.
I think I had, one of the things that was uncanny for me was that it was my first year at my new job at Dartmouth College, and I didn't really know, I was still meeting the community. Mm-hmm. When I arrived that day, I had no idea what it would be like. I expected I might even see conservative students celebrating, but I didn't. I don't know where they were. It was, I'd certainly seen a few of the Make America Great Again hats on campus before the election. And I think what was really sweet that day was there were students who started posting a kind of like post-it graffiti on campus, on the trees and on the walls, and chalk graffiti also, just like messages that were like, "You are loved."
Nice.
Or "Cheer up," which was, but in the context, it was like so. Everything was so bleak that the sort of the sweetness of it actually had a interesting paradoxical appeal,
Because the essay Alexander's talking about is essentially about why we write in the aftermath of Trump, I guess.
Oh, why? I think why write at all?
Yeah. Well,
I think the thing that happened in class almost immediately was one of my very best students, who is now finishing a novel. She said, "What is the point of writing if something like this can happen?" Which I thought was a really interesting question. It had a kind of childlike complaint to it, but also it had a sort of radically direct appeal. Why would you write anything? Why wouldn't you do something else? That's the kind of thing that has always been in the atmosphere around any attempt to discuss being a writer. I remember growing up, there were lots of people who would say, you should be a writer. But then they would also say things like my grandfather, who said, "You'll be happy but poor," and then laughed hilariously like he'd told a joke.
Oh, no.
There were people who were suggesting that maybe I should get an MBA just in case, or so it was this kind of mix of like, go do this thing will bankrupt you, go do this thing, that I was always aware of. Going to parties, we would tell people you're a writer, and immediately in America, at least, the conversation flips to, have I heard of you? Should I know you? Are you famous? Sometimes even, so what are your sales like? Which is, thank you to the person guffawing in the front row. And there is this, as I say in the essay, there's this kind of underlying belief that they should be able to ask you these questions. Because of course, this is what you should be. You shouldn't be unfamous as a writer. You shouldn't be unsuccessful as a writer. All these kinds of assumptions are always around. One of my favorite moments in my life was I went to brunch the day that I got the galley for my first novel in the mail with a friend of mine who was an actress, and we were in New York City. We were at this brunch spot that we both loved. It was like our place, you know. And I was waiting for her. I had the book in a little bag on the table. I wanted to show her, and these two women sitting next to me started talking after they gave their order, and one of them said, "I'm just so sick of how every waiter has a side gig. It's like they're always trying to be an actor, trying to be a writer, trying, like just go be the thing." And I was like, oh my God. You know, like, just was like, I really don't want to go to jail today. And and just as she had delivered that line, my friend appeared, came over, sat down, and then we got to have a very loud conversation about how I'd just finished my new novel after waiting tables for years as I worked on it. So, and they had a very quiet brunch next to us. So.
Amazing. This is truly amazing. I'm thinking back to, in terms of the post-Trump, in terms of, did you feel like a need to get this collection out? Because it came out a year and a half after he was elected, maybe 2 years?
I had already been putting it together, and I think at that point I had sold the book and was finishing it. And one of the things that was immediately apparent and was very interesting to think about was the way in which a book and its context have this relationship, its historical context, have this relationship. And that was part of what reminded me about September 11th, you know, because I remember after September 11th, people felt like there were some things that they couldn't publish, some things that they could. There were people who spoke of a writer's block where they felt like everything was insufficient to the tragedy. And in much the same way, there were people talking about the writer's block that they felt, the despair they felt. You know, most of what we were afraid of has started to happen, or worse things have happened. So everyone who was accusing us of overreacting, it turns out, was a little naive. I remember, you know, I had dinner that night, that first night after the election, at a restaurant that was almost entirely empty. It was normally very full. I was doing this because that day I had noticed, and I talk about this in the essay, that I could not do the thing that I normally do in the morning, which is that I make coffee and I make my breakfast, and this is one of the ways that I have always acted for myself. And so I knew that I had to go and order these things from other people, and they would do them, and then I would be fed, and everything would at least move forward in that way. So thus I was at this restaurant, and there were two people there, a Bernie Sanders supporter who said she hadn't voted, and a Republican who was the bartender who also said he hadn't voted. And they were talking about how great it was going to be and how America was going to get out of all of these wars. And the Republican was an ex-soldier who was re-enlisting. I don't know where he is now. I wonder what he thinks. I wonder if he's fighting. I bet he is.
I first picked up this book because this line kept floating around the internet, which was, it was a summer of wanting impossible things. It's been quoted and quoted and quoted. And it is funny.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that one as being one that, but I think I see a different side of things than what readers see, based on whether people tag me or not.
Oh, tagging the author. I don't know about that. I found it mostly funny because, like, a book like this for me, as a mixed race writer, it felt really impossible. And there's such a lack of language around what it means to be mixed, or like in The Curse, you call it mestizo. Is that how you say it?
So the word, it's a Mexican word, mestizo, which literally means mixed, mestizo. Yeah.
But I'm interested in, like, halfway through the book, you talk about how you could be the first Korean American writer, and then someone beats you to it, so you become the first gay Korean American writer, which I loved. But, like, how did you decide to just be the first and create this kind of language to articulate yourself and your body, I guess?
It was, so at a certain level, you just think that you're writing a novel, you know. And I remember when my first novel, Edinburgh, was under submission. I should say the novel is not set in Scotland, much in the same way that this is not a how-to book. And it uses a piece of Edinburgh's history as a metaphor. The part of the city that was so full of the dead after the Black Plague that instead of removing the bodies from the neighborhood, they simply left them there and buried the neighborhood and built on top of it. And I thought I was writing a novel. And the sales teams were getting back to my agent with questions from the houses that were considering the book, and they were saying things like, is this an immigrant novel, an Asian American novel, is it a gay novel, what is it? And I would say, it's a novel. It's not a coming out story, which is what they thought gay fiction was at the time. This was like 1999, 2000 when these conversations were happening. It wasn't about immigrating to the United States. It wasn't about your parents who immigrated to the United States. It was about other things. And these were just the situations of the character. But it was really profoundly disturbing how people seemed to look past it, even though it was right there. And in a way that doesn't seem to happen now, which I really appreciate. And it's been beautiful to see it back in print and to see readers enjoying it now, mostly. And to see people talking about it and thinking about it. I think at the time that it did actually come out, eventually, it had a wonderful critical reception. I think, my first publisher was an independent publisher who was great at getting it in front of reviewers. Their distribution was less great, but then Picador republished it, and that made all the difference in the world. But still, it was this, you do see your sales eventually. It established me as a writer, for sure, in a way that not everyone's first novel does, and I was very grateful for that. I think, but you never decide, in some ways, to be the first, even though it's like that trick of walking a tightrope, I remember when a group of Asian American literature scholars at the Modern Languages Association conference in, I think at that point it was in San Francisco in 2008. They told me the news that I really was the first. And it felt so lonely, like I was the first fish to walk out of the sea or something. And, I said, "Are you sure?" And they said, "We checked," which was kind of hilarious. So, sometimes I say it and people think I'm kidding. I told a student this a few years ago, and he looked at me in shock. I was trying to urge him, he was a gay Korean American student, to write. I thought he was very talented, and I was trying to get him to take it seriously. And so the proposition roughly was like, I was the first, I'm still one of the few. Join me,
Be
I
another
think he was kind of like, what? But I think it stayed in his mind, I suspect. It's been nice to have spent the last year having conversations with so many young, queer, Asian American writers, Asian writers around the country, around the world, who are now working on projects, and I'm really excited about what our literature will look like in a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, So I think the waves that I've been waiting for are finally happening.
All of the other walking fish emerge.
I'm so sorry for that metaphor, actually. It's kind of disgusting to talk about evolution sometimes.
We'll get through it.
Thank you.
It must have been uncomfortable because I think in The Guardians you write that Edinburgh is a kind of palinode, that when it was published you thought the work was done, but you realise a few years later that it's not done. And you can
go ahead. Sorry.
No.
Let me not engage in
No,
what I call
go.
fake mind reading.
Please.
No, what's the end of the sentence?
My question is the work done now?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I suppose you're always waiting to find out. I think, so the reference that she's talking about in the collection is, I had written a novel about sexual abuse, kind of a fictionalized version of my own experiences, brought into like a somewhat fantastical arrangement of things. And after I had published it, I became aware that people thought that I had dealt with it all. And in fact, what I became aware of was how I had not. That writing a novel about it wasn't the same as having gone to therapy for it. And that there were these ways in which the impulse to hide what had happened to me had even gotten me to hide it from all of the therapists I'd had, such that when I finally did seek someone out for this kind of therapy, she was really shocked and essentially said to me, most of the people I deal with can't say what happened to them, much write a novel about it. So she was sort of in the group that was saying like, well, I think you're done. And I really wasn't. And so in some ways, I think the novel was a way of getting me to the place where I could recuperate myself. I think the recuperation of the self and the growth that you go through as a person these things are always ongoing processes. You're always figuring out new ways to live with it. That particular essay, The Guardians, is about how these ways that you learn to protect yourself as a young person can become ways that you actually can damage yourself when you get older, because it's like you've left some old system that you jury-rigged as a child in charge of your adult life. And you have to figure out how to re-rig your mind and your whole emotional life. And the ways in which all of that had hidden me from myself are what the essay is about, and that's not really what is in the first novel. So I think that's what I meant by, the work not being done. I think what's interesting to me now is I feel ready to begin the adult artistic work of my life. As if all this was just kind of juvenile, yeah. And I'm aware of the kind of horrific hubris of that statement, so don't strike me down, gods. But at the same time, I think when Edinburgh was published, I do remember feeling like, wow, I've shown people one way to approach the novel, now I'll try to show them another. It just took me 15 years. So hopefully it won't take so long, the next one.
I'm not going to ask when the next one is out, but I really want to. Actually, I had a question. I was thinking about this text, this essay collection, as kind of a way of rewriting Edinburgh, like pulling it from fiction into a kind of space between autobiography and fiction.
I used to jokingly call the collection "Everything Bad That Happened to Me." That was there was a period where my publisher was not happy with this title. They were like, "Did you come up with another title?" And I ended up sticking to my guns with the title, obviously, but that was the other choice. Wouldn't have been a bad title, actually, but it was in response to this way in which, when I was working on the novel, originally, the first draft of it that was more autobiographical, my agent read it and her response was, well, no one's going to believe this many bad things happened to someone. And I thought, oh, okay, I am an impossible person in some way that I hadn't anticipated. And that caused me to think about this relationship between, being someone who was trying to write a tragedy. I studied Aristotle's Poetics for the creation of tragedy to figure out the plot for my first novel. And that led to, me touring with the novel, which was this kind of fictional tragedy, and then being someone who knew the private one that informed it, which then became the structure for The Queen of the Night. That was in some ways the way that became that, So The Queen of the Night is in a very, very difficult way to parse, I hope, is like a long meditation on a lot of what I went through with all of that, but it all set in, of course, in the 19th century during the Second Empire with enormous gowns and jewels and opera.
Just in case you
Just
forgot.
in case that's not clear. Yeah. I mean, it's you don't have to think about any of that when you read it, and you probably shouldn't. But if that's interesting to you, that is there.
I read it after the collection, and it immediately reminded me of all of the different jobs that you've had, because the character has so many different occupations.
Yes. I didn't even put all my weird jobs in this book.
Do you have a list?
I mean, not officially.
We don't have enough time. It's fine.
It's not on the resume. It's jobs that you don't put on a resume. But when I was writing The Queen of the Night, actually there was this interesting thing that happened where I wrote 90 pages, and then I thought, oh, that's not the book. And then I wrote another 60 pages that I thought was definitely the book, and then I thought, that's not the book either. And then I wrote 75 pages more, and I thought, that's not really it. And I had this file that I called Chop Bag Queen, which was, I would take giant chunks of text that I would cut out of the novel and put it in there with the idea that what didn't belong in the novel, but maybe it would belong later. And so at some point I looked and I realized that I had like 300 pages in there. And then in the thing that I was calling the novel, I had like 60 pages. And then I thought, well, you should figure this out. And so it was as if, like, with each of those different sections of her life, I couldn't think about the other sections while I was writing it, sort of in the way that she would have partitioned her mind off. It was very strange. The whole writing process for that novel was a lot like being haunted by someone who's never lived, and having lots of conversations with them. But we'll see if that ever happens again.
I'm waiting on the next novel.
Thank you.
I've been thinking a lot about like the concept of decolonial tools, like how what we can do within writing to like decolonize like you're the first queer Korean American writer, like how we can use the form to decolonize like the self or the mind or even the reader's mind. Is that something that you're like actively thinking about, or it just comes out regardless?
I think that the process is possibly something that decolonization is something that you can dramatize, perhaps, but I don't know if it's something that you could, and maybe we'll find out, like put in a novel in the same way that you might administer some sort of remedy, But I do think that it is interesting to try to do, what I call hacking myth, essentially, where you take the structure of myth and you use it to do other things with it, different things, perhaps. They are. At some point, I realized that my childhood fascination with myth and gods and the supernatural was actually a fascination with the way in which these things taught us the rules of the world and even encoded them in people by the way in which we would come to believe them. And so, with my first novel, I tried to recode a myth, as it were, and see if it could do something else. And in this case, I was trying to create a novel about things that people really didn't want to speak about, and I wanted them to think about it and talk about it. And so that paradox was what I was trying to engineer. And I think that's what happened. It's my hope that that's what happened.
It's a good hope. The myth that you hack in Edinburgh is like quite interesting because it's a Korean myth or a Japanese myth?
So the fox demon is a creature that is in China, Korea, and Japan, and that was interesting to me.
I was thinking about it in terms of like you're using this like Korean storytelling alongside like within the English language, so you're bringing these two cultures together in this one space. No question. That was a terrible example of a question because we're just about to come up to question time.
Here we go.
There we go.
Sorry. Hi, thanks Alexander so much for the talk. When I read How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, the longing realization I had was maybe this is the first time I'd read a memoir that was written without a collective memory. I think, writing your own story, particularly if you're from a diaspora or have had some history of migration or separation, can be really overwhelming because there are those parts of periods of losses, whether it's a collective loss, a family loss, or an individual loss of memory through a coping mechanism or an active erasure that makes it really hard to tell your story. But reading your novel, I felt like you were able to approach this idea that you could have a narrative with gaps in between. Is that something that you saw as a theme of your novel? Is that something that you wanted to explore, or is it just a coincidence that it comes across that way?
That is actually a coincidence. But I'm so happy that that was the realization you had. I think, and when you're putting together an essay collection, the problem that you encounter is that the essays were usually published apart from each other, and they come to a kind of uneasy coexistence that you hope to make slightly less uneasy. One of the it seems like it should be more obvious than it is, but one of the problems is that you introduce yourself as a character in the essays to your audience. And as a group, you don't want to have the effect of it being like, hey, it's me. Here I am again. What's up? It's me. And you don't want it to be redundant either, where the reader's reading and they're thinking like, he just left San Francisco and now he's back in San Francisco. What the heck? So that's why we decided to try to structure it chronologically in a sense. And I think the interesting accident of what was created is something that I think of as interconnected stories of the self. So at some points I introduce a theme or an idea or an event, and in other places I expand on it. And so these intersections happen, a sort of fretwork, because it all does belong to me, starts to grow into place. And so I really look forward to people engaging with this idea that you, I think I'm still pointing to the questioner. I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on. To this idea that you've introduced, because I think that's a remarkable way of thinking about it for people who are trying to do that. To try to let go of the idea that you need to make those connections that you can't make, Typically, for me, when I'm writing nonfiction, I try to make what I consider to be the problem, the thing that would make the writing impossible. I try to make that into the structure and to deliberately describe the struggles with it as a way to get around it. And I think that could be something like this.
Hello?
There we go.
Hi. So it's really interesting that you said earlier how you were talking about hacking myth, because one of the essays of yours that really strikes a chord with me is the one where you talk about what you do with your father's, the inheritance from your father after he passes. And I was really interested in how you, for me, kind of hack this myth of death. Like when I was reading it, and I was going through a lot of my own grief stuff at the time, I kind of was like amazed by the moment when you buy the sports car and that's like the first thing you do with the inheritance. Because I was like, yeah, I like booked flights to London. And it's kind of cool that you hacked this like myth of death as this kind of like really potent like emotional feeling when sometimes you do just kind of these silly things and have to deal with the realities of money and stuff. So I don't know, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how, have you ever considered it that way, or how maybe you worked through writing about death and grief and inheritance?
Sure. That essay began for me as a way to think about how it was that receipts made me feel pain. People would say, "Do you want this receipt?" And I would say, "Okay." Like I knew that I should take them, but it felt like this kind of faint burning sensation each time it landed in the hand. So then I thought, okay, it's time to think about your relationship to money. And that led me to grief, and to this experience with inheriting money after my father's death, which felt like this thing that was both amazing and horrible, and the amazing parts made the horrible parts feel more horrible, and vice versa. So I think, I didn't realize that there was so little written about it also. When I published that essay online at BuzzFeed, an excerpt of it, I had all these readers who wrote to me and who thanked me for breaking a taboo, and I thought, I had no idea there was a taboo about writing about money. So all of you should write about money more. That's just something I put out there. And I'm not sure what that is, but for me, I think, I've had some finance bloggers actually write about this essay and talk about how the emotional narrative to your relationship to money is something that everyone needs to think about. I have always wanted for there to not be any money, even as I have also always wanted to have lots of money. And as a child, I had these fantasies of having my own island. I think someone asked me when I was a kid what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to live on my own island. That was my job that I chose when I was I think 8 years old, and it still kind of appeals, to be honest. But these are the ways that we are. We like to think that money has a sort of neutral relationship to us in some way, but it's always so intense and so personal, and I think the less we pretend that, the better off we are. Yeah. I hope that made sense. Yes.
Hi, my name's Daisy, and I'm trying to work on my first memoir at the moment, Quarter Life Crisis. And something you said really struck a chord with me. You said that when you'd done your first book, that they said that the work wasn't done, like the internal work, right? And this is something that worries me, because I see, I've talked to a few first-time writers, and it's on one hand, people say, make sure the work's done. On the other hand, it's that's okay, continue to write. So to what degree do you think people should publish the work if, in some way, it's sort of some therapy for them, but it obviously is not complete therapy? What's your view on that?
My view on that is if you are writing about something personal to yourself and you're figuring it out as you're writing it, I think that you should be doing some personal writing that you don't publish at all about the same topic, and engage in a process that I call tell yourself the truth first before you tell anyone else, so that you can really think about it and think about how you want to shape the writing that you're doing around it. It's very demoralizing, possibly even re-traumatizing, to be writing about these difficult things and to be writing about it for deadline, for publication, because you will be engaging in all kinds of reactions to any blind spots or triggers that you have, or all these things will come into play, and your editor is not a therapist, and neither is your writing group, and neither are you. Just you in general, not you specifically. I mean, you might be a therapist, but yeah, I think there's the work that's working on yourself, which may never be done. So don't wait until that's done to publish something about it. But then there's the work that the writing requires of you, and you just want to be, making something out of your experience, such that you can offer some wisdom to others. And so I think the writing that you do, that's therapeutic, that's just for you, is a way of ensuring that you have some of that wisdom to offer in the manuscript. So does that make sense? I don't think there's any reason to stay away from trying to publish that memoir. I think just be sure to really walk yourself through what you're trying to describe.
I think we have time for one more question.
One more question, yeah.
Hi. I'd just like to say your essay, The Rosary, just particularly beautiful. And what struck me was your relationship with nature and how a space and a process shapes you. But we're shaped either in two ways, like cutting a sculpture from marble, weathering something away, or being built up, accumulated by our experiences. Do you think in your writing you are the chiseling away of something or the accumulation of it, and how that affects this sort of cyclical process of coming to a house with a murder, leaving with a beautiful garden, life coming from death, and how that changed you, not how you changed it?
I think that for those of you who haven't read the collection, the essay is talking about it's the chronicle of creating a rose garden in this backyard in Brooklyn for a period of about 7 years. And the essay began as a gardening journal that I kept because that's what you're supposed to do when you garden. You're supposed to write about your garden. In case you didn't know that, in case you're just out there gardening without a journal. Because it helps you keep track, like how much sun do you have? What are the seasons like? What are the cycles of the seasons? Etc. Those are the kinds of things that you learn eventually by keeping a garden journal. And it's a lot of fun because it's writing that really is for you and also isn't really about you, even though it also is probably really about you. And I was really amused by some of the things that made their way into my gardening journal. So there's times when it just becomes a journal. And so I think you are both when you are a writer. I think that's sort of the possible paradox of it. I think for me as a writer, what I learned in the process was that I write a bit like a gardener, where I have these different projects that are coming up over time, and I check on them to see what's happening with them. In the collection, 10 of the essays had been previously published, 6 had not. The collection was in some ways a way for me to consider finishing some of those essays that had lingered for years unfinished, including The Rosary, which had been in my files for so long that my agent had despaired of ever seeing it. And unfortunately, I had spoken to her husband about it, who would ask every now and then, like, did he finish that gardening essay? And so it's I think there's all these, if there's some way that looking through all of that helps you figure out what your relationship to it all is, absolutely run with that. And thank you. And thank you all, because I think we have reached the end of our time, bring this flashing light on the stage.
Well, we're all waiting for how to write an autobiographical garden journal. Please give a warm round of applause for Alexander Chee.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.